I'll end on that.
Thank you very much. I think you're all in danger of agreeing, actually. I think your bookshelves would overlap significantly. And to play devil's advocate a bit here, look, there are plenty of people who think that their great books, the classic books, are a Western imperialist view of history and of society, and picking out Middlemarch as the book that should be studied at school is ridiculous. I mean, how could you study Middlemarch at school? The average school kid wouldn't be able to cope with the sentence structure, let alone the moral content, which is quite sophisticated, obviously. So what are you doing putting those books above the greatest contemporary writers as another group of people would see them? Who are you to dictate that these are the great writers? I suspect your answer is, with the books of the past, they'd pass the test of time. But with contemporary writers, let's focus on that. With contemporary writers, who are you to say that this is the canon, these are the great writers? Surely that's just as political as imposing what you called a Labour Party agenda on the curriculum.
Well, I think in answer to your second point, I'm not sure that contemporary literature needs to be taught in schools. I think it could. I'd be perfectly content for it to stop at the beginning of the 20th century. What was your oh yeah, you thought that the problem with teaching GCSE English students Middlemarch is that they wouldn't be able to cope with it. This is often an argument made against trying to teach children a more demanding curriculum than the absolutely detestable national curriculum, and I share your loathing of it. And I was interested that your point wasn't that I was wrong in my description of comprehensives. You were just saying that I was wrong to imagine that all independent schools were any better, and I'm sure that's true. I'm sure they're equally piss poor, many of them. And of course, there are some exceptional comprehensives which are very good and better than many independent schools, but they're fairly rare. That argument was made in The Guardian recently, Nigel, by someone who was described as an award-winning teacher. He said that the decision by the last government to drop the need to study a modern foreign language at GCSE from the national curriculum was quite wise and proper, because most children, in his view, and he's an award-winning teacher, can't cope with learning a modern foreign language. And he said trying to teach a bottom set Year 11s from a northern council estate, and that was the phrase this award-winning teacher used, was a definition of misery. And that, I think, is a classic example of what E.D. Hirsch, an American educationalist and a great promoter of what he calls the core curriculum, a classic example of the tyranny, the soft despotism of low expectations. Of course, the bottom set Year 11s from a northern council estate are not going to be able to escape from that council estate. They're not going to be able to compete with the products of the neighbouring grammar schools and independent schools if you don't even make an attempt to teach them a modern foreign language on the grounds that they simply cannot cope. You don't attempt to teach them a book as difficult as Middlemarch because, of course, it's completely beyond them. I think that's nonsense, and that if you have high enough expectations and if these things are delivered in the right way, if you get the pedagogy right, then, of course, you can teach the great books to a group of mixed ability children. When Harold Wilson oversaw the massive expansion of comprehensive schools in the mid-60s, he described them as grammar schools for all. Of course, that's not what they are now, but that is what they were sold as, and I think it's what they can be, and that is very much the aim of the West London Free School, to create a grammar school for all, where all children, including the bottom set in Year 11 from the local council estate, are taught books like Middlemarch.
Very quickly, Catherine Birble's thing, I meant to say this before, is a victim of a modern heresy. It's as straightforward as that. She is being treated as a heretic by the new church of extreme authoritarian left-wing ideology. She is simply, they can't bear it. They can't bear, you can see it even now, absolutely. They cannot bear the fact that she busted the taboo, and they won't forgive her for it. And they'll keep on punishing her, and they won't look at whether what she said was true or not, but simply whether or not it fits in with their ideas. And that brings me on to the second thing I wanted to say, which is this terrible mistake of thinking that the way in which you educate a child is to educate from the child outwards, as it were, that everything must be made relevant to the child's experience. And this is why and it goes on to university level now, the way in which as it were, minority writings gay literature and all this sort of thing. If it's literature, it's just literature. Don't give it a subcategory, or the guarantee is it is second rate at best. But this idea that you start from the child and you know, I mean, if the idea that you start from the child, what are your experiences, and now we can find connections in literature, instead of saying, here is the panoply of human experience, human greatness, and you can see outwards. Instead of teaching people to see outwards, we teach them to find the meaning solely in what they already experience. And if there is not yet a self, what is there to recognise?
But Douglas, how would you respond to the point I was trying to make earlier about the value for students or pupils to recognise something of their own experience in the great books that they are taught?
I'd say this. Obviously, I mean, one of the things about the canon, I should have responded to this earlier, quite right. One of the things about the canon is it's always evolving, it can always be added to, it can always be debated over. And there will be people who will decide that, you know, Shakespeare isn't as good as REM or whatever, but you know, they will probably lose their debates. So the debate is fine and it's healthy. And of course there are times when the canon needs modification, exactly in the way you suggest. I mean, I think it's preposterous that there wouldn't be a female writer on the course there. But, so yes, of course, add when it is necessary, but don't for a moment engage in the lie. So, for instance, Virginia Woolf deserves to be on the canon, not because she's a woman writer, but she finds her way on it and it helps other women, but she finds her way on it because she is a great writer. And there has been there always, when you adapt the canon, you adapt and allow second-rate, third-rate, worst people on.
But she was excluded because she was a woman.
Did you argue for her to be included, not because she was a woman, but because she was as good as Thomas Hardy and T.S. Eliot?
But that had been overlooked or neglected because she had been
I just wanted to come back on Elika's the point you made to Douglas, which is often an argument you hear. You can't hope to teach the canon to a group of mixed ability children who are of different races and different cultural backgrounds, because nothing in it will be relevant to them. They won't be able to engage with it and relate to it. But the reason the classics have stood the test of time is because, not only because they're so well written, but because they deal with universal themes that everyone can relate to, regardless of their particular experience.
But you want to get rid of contemporary writing from this curriculums, which to me is a very controversial position. You may all agree on that, but many people think that writers of today are talking in a different way.
Well, I'd include
you may
How to
not
Lose
be
Friends
able to
and Alienate
establish
People.
who is on the canon for all time, but you're really seriously diminishing students' opportunities if you don't have the idea that people actually write today and address present-day concerns. Writing isn't just something in a museum of ideas.
But can I begin? I think Toby was wrong on that. I don't like saying that. I agree with so much he says. But I certainly wouldn't cut it off at the 20th century by any means. But I think there should always be a cut-off point roughly 20 or 30 years before the time of writing, because it takes too long to work out what a good book is. Everyone knows from the Booker Prize, among other things, any major literary prize, how easily 1 year's novel can turn out not to be very important in the great scheme of things, not very good, a subject of a trend. So you always need a certain distance. I say 20 or 30 years is a good one, but you certainly need 20th century literature, Toby. That's
Yes, I'd agree with Douglas on the need to teach 20th century literature. We are now teaching courses, delivering courses even at Oxford on the 21st century. And we're appointing people to jobs in 20th and 21st century literary expertise.
I think the reality is that most secondary schools, children emerge at the age of 16 having only read one book, and that book is To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah. And it's because there's a movie of the books they can watch.
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies, but it's now more often To Kill a Mockingbird because it has this kind of positive message about racism.
But in philosophy, it would be really bizarre to teach philosophy without teaching contemporary thinkers. If you want the best, you want the best, the people who've had access to the great history of the subject and developed it. So aren't you contradicting yourself by saying you only want the best and we're going to exclude living writers?
One of the great mistakes, if I may say so, has just been made, which is the idea that we are better than the greats because we come after them, that we are wiser than Plato because we know about the splitting of the atom. I think this is a terrible mistake in philosophy and in literature. Because you've come after us, this is a Whig interpretation. I hope you recognise. The idea that you are better because you come after, or what is most recent is better tthan the past, is a terrible mistake.
I don't think that that's what Nigel was implying by saying that we teach contemporary writing. I agree. It's difficult to make critical judgments about the contemporary, what has just been written. That is difficult, but I wouldn't want to exclude it from consideration. No, because teaching canons or delivering canons also means making decisions about them, and that is a conversation that has to be held in an ongoing way. That we continually keep the canon up for discussion. And we continually also think about how to teach Shakespeare and relate him to the present time. I do think that the Shakespeare scholars out there have succeeded remarkably in that. Shakespeare is one of the freshest writers, I think, around today, and a living writer to many students, because he seems to relate to their concerns.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you to think of one book, not Middlemarch, that you think would deliver what you've argued for education of the future. Just say very briefly why. So, Toby, have you got a book that you would give us that's not Middlemarch?
I think probably David Copperfield. But if it was, instead of teaching civics, I would teach Locke's Second Treatise of Government.
Can I go for the obvious and say the First Folio? Or variations of it?
You asking for a literary text or?
It's up to you.
I would teach if it was a political text. I did teach Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes. If it were a literary text, I'd have to go for Jane Eyre every time.